comes the throw. He slides.
What if one of the funniest and most beloved sports films ever made was born not from ambition, not from studio executives' big idea, but from the deep, personal heartbreak of a Cleveland Indians fan who simply could not take it anymore? That is exactly how Major League came alive. It began in frustration, was filmed during one of the hottest summers Wisconsin had seen in nearly a century, featured actors injuring themselves left and right on real baseball fields, and somehow, against all the odds Hollywood could stack against it, became a defining film of its generation and one of the most profitable comedies of the entire year it was released. The movie cost $11 million to produce. It earned $75 million worldwide. It introduced the world to a fictional relief pitcher named Ricky Vaughn and, in doing so, accidentally changed the way real Major League Baseball teams operate to this day. The actors were hurt. The director was exhausted. The test audiences rejected the original ending. And one of the film's most iconic lines was never written down anywhere. It was made up on the spot by a broadcaster who was not even supposed to be a professional broadcaster in the eyes of the man who cast him. There are 20 facts buried in the making of this movie that most fans have never heard. Some are funny, some are shocking, some are genuinely hard to believe. But every single one of them is true. Let's get into all of them right now. David S. Ward, the writer and director of Major League, grew up in Shaker Heights, Ohio, as a devoted Cleveland Indians fan. He had loved that team his entire life, and that loyalty had cost him dearly in emotional terms. By the time the 1970s and 1980s rolled around, the Indians had become one of the most consistently poor franchises in all of professional baseball. They were not just losing. They were setting a standard for futility that the city of Cleveland had unfortunately grown all too comfortable with. Ward had already proven himself in Hollywood. He wrote The Sting, which won the Academy Award for Best Original Screenplay in 1974. He was a serious, credentialed filmmaker, but his love for the Indians was something that lived in an entirely different part of him. The part that sat in the stands as a kid and believed every spring that maybe this would be the year. It never was. And after decades of watching his hometown team stumble and collapse, something shifted in his thinking. He told ESPN in an interview that he began to suspect the only way he would ever see the Cleveland Indians win anything meaningful was if he wrote a story in which they did it himself. That was the seed, not a pitch meeting, not a studio request. A man sitting with his frustration and deciding to give his favorite team the fictional championship they could never seem to claim in real life. He turned the premise into a comedy because the situation of the Indians was, in many ways, already darkly comedic. The result was Major League. The Real Indians would go on to reach the World Series in 1995, 1997, and again in 2016. They lost all 3 times. Ward had channeled his skepticism correctly. This is one of the most startling admissions in the history of sports movies. Charlie Sheen, who played the wild and unpredictable relief pitcher Ricky Vaughn, openly admitted in a 2011 interview with Sports Illustrated that he took steroids for a period of 6 to 8 weeks while preparing for his role. He was not trying to look bigger or more physically imposing. His goal was purely functional. He wanted to throw harder. At baseline, Sheen could pitch the ball at roughly 79 miles per hour, which is respectable for a non-athlete actor, but nowhere near the level of a real professional pitcher. After his steroid cycle, he had pushed that number up to around 85 miles per hour. He was candid about the fact that the drugs made him more irritable and emotionally volatile during that stretch, which, considering the character he was playing, may have actually contributed something to the performance. However, the truth of the filmmaking process reveals that even 85 miles per hour was not enough. Ricky Vaughn is portrayed in the film as a pitcher who can throw 100-mile-per-hour fastballs. No amount of pharmaceutical assistance was going to bridge that gap. So director David Ward and his cinematography team used a combination of camera angles, editing cuts, and visual tricks to create the illusion of blazing speed. Sheen's genuine improvement helped the footage look more authentic than it would have otherwise, but the real cinematic magic was done in the editing room. The steroid use was real. The 100-mile-per-hour fastball was not. The casting process for Major League produced one of the most chaotic and accidentally perfect audition stories in Hollywood history. Wesley Snipes, who was brought in to read for the role of Willie Mays Hayes, a blazingly fast outfielder with a personality as large as his speed, arrived at the tryout having come directly from another engagement. He had not had time to change clothes. While every other actor auditioning for a baseball-related role showed up in athletic gear or at least casual athletic clothing, Snipes walked through the door wearing a pilot's flight suit and boxing shoes. The visual alone was already unforgettable. But the audition had not even started yet. When the producers asked him to run the bases as part of the athletic component of the tryout, the boxing shoes, which have smooth, flat soles designed for the interior of a boxing ring, not a dirt baseball diamond, provided him with essentially no traction whatsoever. He rounded first base. He rounded second base. And somewhere between second and third, physics took over. His feet slid out from beneath him, and rather than continuing his path to third base, he veered sharply and dramatically off course, heading straight into the outfield. Everyone watching broke into genuine, unscripted laughter. Snipes eventually recovered, made his way back to home plate, and completed what could only generously be described as the tryout. The producers then brought him into the office and told him he had the part. He later said the whole experience was completely absurd and that the laughter in the room was entirely real. The chaos of that audition, it turned out, captured something true about the character he was about to play. Before Major League entered the picture, Wesley Snipes had already made a significant impression in Hollywood. His most notable credit was appearing in Martin Scorsese's music video for Michael Jackson's Bad, which had given him significant visibility. But the real decision point in his career at that moment was not Major League at all. It was a film being directed by Spike Lee. Lee, who was already recognized as one of the most important and innovative voices in American cinema, offered Snipes the role of Radio Raheem in Do the Right Thing. This was not a small opportunity. Do the Right Thing went on to receive an Academy Award nomination and is today considered one of the essential American films of the 20th century. It was the kind of project that elevates careers. Snipes said no. He chose Major League instead. At the time, this decision struck many observers as strange at best and career-ending at worst. Do the Right Thing was considered a near-certain critical and cultural success. Major League was an unproven sports comedy with an uncertain future. Snipes went with the baseball movie. The gamble worked out. His performance as the lightning-fast Willie Mays Hayes made him a fan favorite and opened doors that led to a string of high-profile opportunities throughout the early 1990s. And Spike Lee, to his credit, held no grudge. He subsequently gave Snipes prominent roles in Mo Better Blues and Jungle Fever. Snipes has spoken publicly about how grateful he remains to Lee for his continued support despite that early rejection. Almost all of the baseball footage in Major League was shot at Milwaukee County Stadium in Wisconsin. The production used Milwaukee's ballpark for on-field action, crowd sequences, and a climactic game at the end of the film. But the story was set in Cleveland, and the filmmakers knew they needed at least one shot that felt authentically Clevelander. The solution they devised was remarkably inventive, and it required the cooperation of the actual Cleveland Indians organization. On July 3rd, during a real Indians home game against the Seattle Mariners, the team agreed to pause between innings, specifically at the 7th inning, for 60 additional seconds beyond the normal break. That 60-second window was all the production team needed. A helicopter was already in position over Cleveland Municipal Stadium, and it flew over the packed ballpark during that extended pause, capturing aerial footage of more than 27,000 fans filling the seats with no players on the field. That single shot, lasting only a few seconds in the final film, gave Major League the visual authenticity it needed to feel genuinely set in Cleveland. The reason the production could not simply film at Cleveland Municipal Stadium for the rest of the movie had nothing to do with the fans or the team. The stadium had lighting issues that made nighttime filming impractical, and because the Cleveland Browns used the facility for preseason football games, their cleats had left visible lines and damage across the grass that would have been immediately identifiable as a football field to any baseball-savvy viewer. When the cast and crew of Major League arrived in Milwaukee on July 30th of 1988, they received a welcome that went considerably beyond what a film production normally expects. Wisconsin Governor Tommy Thompson showed up personally at Milwaukee County Stadium to greet the production team. That alone was unusual. What followed was even more remarkable. Approximately 15,000 local residents also showed up that day, not to watch a baseball game, but simply to be present for the arrival of a Hollywood film crew and to volunteer as crowd extras. Thompson formalized the occasion by presenting director David Ward with an official commemorative plaque and declaring July 30th and 31st as Major League Weekend throughout the state of Wisconsin. Ward and his team capitalized on the enthusiasm immediately. Rather than working up to the crowd scenes gradually, he made the decision to film those sequences first, while the community's excitement was at its peak and most genuine. The energy he captured in those early shooting days proved difficult to replicate artificially, and the decision to seize it immediately was wise. The locals continued to show up in large numbers throughout the shoot. Their enthusiasm did not fade. This was fortunate because the summer of 1988 was, by historical records, one of the hottest summers Milwaukee had experienced in 75 years. Cast, crew, and thousands of volunteer extras endured that heat together throughout the production. One of the most beloved elements of Major League is the film's fictional radio announcer Harry Doyle, played with perfectly deadpan, seen-it-all energy by Bob Uecker. The character's commentary, sardonic, world-weary, and frequently tipping quietly into despair, provides a running emotional backdrop throughout the film that audiences have never forgotten. But there is an extraordinary piece of behind-the-scenes truth attached to that casting decision. Director David Ward cast Bob Uecker because he thought Uecker was primarily a comedic actor and personality. Ward had seen him in Miller Lite beer commercials, where Uecker played a lovably self-deprecating figure, and in the television sitcom Mr. Belvedere. To Ward's eyes, Uecker was funny, recognizable, and perfectly suited for the role of a long-suffering announcer calling games for a terrible team. He made the decision based on those performances. It was only when Ward and Uecker met in person for the first time that Ward discovered the truth. Bob Uecker was, and had been for nearly 2 decades at that point, the actual broadcast voice of the Milwaukee Brewers. He was not merely a comedian who sometimes played at sports commentary. He was a Hall of Fame broadcaster who had called thousands of real Major League Baseball games and who had spent his professional life in the booth. Ward had accidentally cast perhaps the single most qualified person on the planet to play the role. Uecker brought his decades of genuine broadcasting experience to the character and used it to make Harry Doyle feel completely real. Several of his most memorable lines, including the phrases he used to describe errant pitches and hopeless situations, were improvised entirely in the moment. If you have spent any amount of time watching baseball on television over the past 3 decades, you have heard some version of the phrase just a bit outside. Broadcasters use it constantly to describe a pitch that has missed the strike zone, sometimes by inches, sometimes by several feet. It has become so embedded in the language of baseball commentary that most fans probably assume it has always existed as a piece of common sports vernacular. It did not. Bob Uecker invented it during the filming of Major League, describing a particularly wild pitch thrown by the Ricky Vaughn character. The line was not written anywhere. It was not in the script. It was not suggested by the director or developed through rehearsal. Uecker simply opened his mouth, and those 4 words came out in exactly the right combination of understatement and resignation that made them instantly, enduringly funny. Film critic Roger Ebert's publication noted in 2019 that the line had been adopted and repeated by virtually every baseball broadcaster in the country at some point over the 30-plus years since the film's release. Bleacher Report, in a 2011 ranking, placed it 5th on a list of the greatest sports movie quotes ever spoken on film. A throwaway, improvised moment during the shooting of a baseball comedy became one of the most quoted lines in the entire history of sports movies. Before Major League came out in 1989, relief pitchers did not typically have theme songs. They walked in from the bullpen. The crowd reacted. The pitcher warmed up. That was the routine. The idea of a specific piece of music blasting through the stadium as a particular player made his entrance was not a widespread custom in professional baseball. Then came the scene in Major League, where Ricky Vaughn walks slowly in from the bullpen while the Trog's song, Wild Thing, thunders through the stadium speakers, the crowd rising and roaring in a wave of noise and energy. It was a fictional moment in a fictional film, but it hit something real. Almost immediately after the movie's release, Philadelphia Phillies relief pitcher Mitch Williams, who already carried the nickname Wild Thing because of his unpredictable and